district and state levels, our K-12 and higher ed working groups, and any participants from our Ad Tech and Location and Smart Cities working groups. We really appreciate all of you joining us today. Today, your primary host is going to be Kelsey Finch, also from the Future of Privacy Forum. As a reminder, if you did not register for this call and would like notes or a recording of the presentation afterwards, please email us at avance, A-V-A-N-C-E, @fps.org, as we will only be sending out notes and the recording to those who have registered. As you could have inferred from that statement, we are recording today through the time of Q&A. So please be aware of that. Anyone who has comments, since we have such a large group, you can enter them in the Google Doc sent out in the email this morning. We will also have the link to the Google Doc in the chat box. With that, I am now going to turn things over to my colleague, Kelsey Finch.
All right, thanks, Amelia, and thanks to all of you on the line for joining us. I'm really excited to be leading you into a deep dive on de-identification this afternoon. I am joined by, there we go, two amazing speakers. Mike Hintze, who is a partner at Hintze Law and a thought leader in the law and policy of de-identification, and Daniel Barth-Jones, who is an assistant professor of clinical epidemiology at Columbia University and a leading statistical disclosure control expert in the US. And so I think, as many of you know, this is the first of a two-part series on de-identification for education. And this part will be sort of the survey course. We're going to do an overview of the law, policy, and technical aspects of de-identification that we think are helpful for everyone, but you will have a deeper dive into FERPA and education-specific context on Friday. So please register for that, the same place that you registered for this conference. And so just to make the point, what we're really hoping you will walk away with today is, first, a broad understanding of key terms and techniques for de-identification. Second, an appreciation for the spectrum of re-identification risk and sort of data identifiability. And three, a solid foundation for the more specific discussion on education this Friday. So this is the Survey 101 course. Friday will hopefully be your 201 dive into FERPA and other pieces of legislation. So a couple of housekeeping notes. As Amelia said, we have time reserved for Q&A at the end, and please share in the Google Doc in advance. We are also recording. Please send us emails. If not to avance, to kfinch@fpf.org. Both of those are on the slide in front of you. And so before I hand it off to our speakers, I wanted to take a second to share FPF's perspective on de-identification and why we think it's so important to educate all of you on this important topic. So as we all know, de-identification is one of the primary measures that organizations use to protect data and privacy, both in the public and private sector. And yet, at the same time, it's also one of the most challenging and controversial measures that privacy professionals and others like yourselves might grapple with. Scientists and regulators frequently refer to certain categories of information as personal or personally identifiable, while at the same time, rooms away, businesses and others will define them, the same types of data, as de-identified or anonymous. And so as we at FPF look across these sectors, we see time and time a disconnect between the promise of de-identification and the reality of it. Because in practice, effective de-identification requires a lot of hard work, both as a technical and a organizational and policy matter. It's tough to keep on the cutting edge, even for folks like us who do this every day. So one of the ways that we've tried to make sense of this confusion of overlapping legal definitions of technical standards around de-identification is by looking at data not as a binary, not as either personal or not personal, de-identified or PII, but looking at data on a spectrum of identifiability. And so that's the visual that you have in front of you, is sort of our visual guide to practical data de-identification. And so, it's looking at sort of the full range of data. It can be everything from, social security numbers in an identifiable record that all the way up to really hard to broad statistical analyses that have a significantly lower risk of re-identification. And so hopefully, as you look at this and feel free to come reach out to us later if you want to talk more about the actual visual. But this hopefully describes how you can take a record full of PII, and by starting to apply different kinds of technical or operational or legal controls to the direct and the indirect identifiers, you can move yourself further down the identifiability spectrum. And so although this visual doesn't capture it, we also look at the risk of re-identification as a spectrum, depending on the amount of protection that you have in place, what utility you need to preserve in the data, because of course, de-identifying data sort of inherently removes some utility, and then also the likelihood that somebody is actually going to try to re-identify that data. So one of the things I hope you keep in mind as you listen to Mike and Dan today is that while you'll never be able to guarantee zero risk of re-identification, there are many tools and concepts that will help you situate and mitigate the risks of re-identification appropriately given your particular circumstances. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our experts. Mike is going to start by giving us a comparative introduction to the general law and policy perspective on de-identification, but with a reminder that you will have a deeper dive into FERPA on Friday. So Mike, I'm handing control over to you, and hopefully you'll be able to share your slides with us in a second.
Okay. First of all, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Excellent. Okay, let me get my slides up here. And can you see my slides now?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So let me jump to my first slide. First of all, I just want to sort of go over some high-level points on de-identification, building on what Kelsey just mentioned. First of all, I think it's important to think about de-identification in the right way. And the way I think about it is a way to reduce the risk of processing personal data. It's a way to reduce the sensitivity and the risk of something bad happening with personal data. It's not a silver bullet. You don't do de-identification and then you're done. There's been a lot of stories around times where de-identification fell short, or somebody thought data had been de-identified effectively and it was re-identified. But there's always some other factor going on. Either the data was shared publicly in a way that maybe it didn't need to be, or there was some other failure. So the way I think about de-identification is that it is part of it's a tool in the toolbox. It's not the only thing you should be doing when thinking about a privacy and security program, but it can be a very, very effective risk reduction, risk mitigation tool in combination with other measures that you may take to protect the privacy and security of data. And as Kelsey mentioned, and as visually demonstrated in that great chart that the FPF has put together, there are a wide variety and range of de-identification methods and resulting strengths of the de-identification. And when you're looking at de-identification options, you need to sort of balance the goal of maximizing the strength with the needs you have for the data. Some ways of de-identifying data can reduce the utility of the data, reduce the value that can come from the data. And so it's always striking that right balance, finding the strongest method that you can use, the way that you can reduce the risk the most, but that's still compatible with the needs you need to analyze or use the data in a variety of ways. And then, similar to the first part about it reducing risk, in terms of legal compliance, just sort of meeting your obligations under the law, it can be also an effective tool. Some laws call out anonymization, we'll get to the use of that word in a second, or pseudonymization, or other types of de-identification as one way you can meet certain legal obligations around protecting data, around data security, et cetera. And in many cases, the privacy laws themselves are scoped to certain definitions of personal data or PII or student records or student data or whatever the term is that's used in the particular law. And those terms often have things like directly tied to an individual or or some other way that sort of defines what makes it personal data as opposed to non-personal data. And if you can use a de-identification method that sort of goes to the very far ends of the spectrum where you could truly call it anonymous, in many cases it takes you outside the scope of those privacy laws altogether. So, you know, in some cases it is a partial way of meeting obligations. In some ways, it is in fact a complete way of meeting obligations in the sense that it takes you outside the scope of the law, and other obligations of the law don't apply anymore. So that's another thing to keep in mind, and we can talk about that as we go through different laws. So sort of the corollary between de-identification and this concept of personal data and all the synonyms for personal data, you know, PII, et cetera, is one I want to explore a little bit here. And one is that, you know, one of the things that the FPF was trying to get at in developing that chart and the work that was associated with that is trying to help drive some consensus on terminology, because the terminology is all over the map and people use these terms for different things, and it causes confusions and people sort of talking past each other in this space often. You know, you've got these terms like personally identifiable information or personal data, which are used in different laws, and sometimes people use, you know, PII in a very narrow sense. You know, it's your name, it's your social security number, it's credit card number, but you know, things like demographic information or IP addresses or things like that shouldn't be thought of as PII, which I think puts people into a bit of a trap and misdirects people in some ways. The clear trend in the law is towards very broad concepts, very broad definitions of these concepts, where things like device identifiers and IP addresses and really any unique identifiers, cookie IDs, things like that can potentially bring it within the scope. And obviously each law that you're looking at, you need to evaluate that differently, but the trend is to interpret them quite broadly. I tend to use the personal data term just because it gets away from a lot of the baggage around some of the terms that are found that have been traditionally used, you know, here in the United States, like PII. It maps to the European law, which is driving a lot of sort of global discussions around this. But you know, whatever term you use, just kind of make sure you're trying to be precise about what that actually means. And then on the other side of the coin, anonymous, pseudonymous, de-identified, aggregated, those terms are used often interchangeably. Anonymous is, I try to tell people, don't use the A word unless you really mean it. Anonymous is sometimes thrown around as a way to say, oh, don't worry, this data is anonymous. And that's where you have seen some of the failures of anonymity as they've been characterized, where, you know, the data was de-identified, but it was de-identified in a way that it was able to be reversed. And I would say sort of here's another trend in terminology that more and more people, I think, are reserving the term anonymous for sort of that far end of the spectrum, as it's reflected in the FPF framework. And to use the word anonymous for types of de-identification that maybe aren't as strong, aren't as irreversible, aren't as complete, can also cause problems. And you know, even the FTC has sort of started saying that, you know, using that word for lesser forms of de-identification may actually be a deceptive practice, and that could get folks into trouble as well. So, you know, just be careful about the terms that are being used. And then there's sort of different concepts that might feed into these terminologies. So what makes data personal data? Well, if it's identified, if as part of that data set, there's information in there that makes it clear who it relates to, that's clearly personal data. If it's identifiable, you know, you could easily match a unique identifier in one record to another record that has a name or an address. That makes it personal data pretty clearly. Contactable. I've seen some people say, oh, well, an email address, it could be, you know, some pseudonym or whatever. It doesn't really tell you who it is. But if the data allows you to reach out and touch somebody, connect to them directly, communicate with them directly, that's going to clearly be within the scope of personal data. Increasingly, even in data sets where you know, you don't know who it is necessarily in the real world by looking at it. And this, you know, online behavioral profiles that are used for advertising, for example, it might be a cookie ID that's just, you know, cookie 85327. It's a longer number than that, but with some behavioral information associated with it. Well, that doesn't tell you who it is, but it allows you to treat that unique individual associated with that cookie differently by showing a different ad or a different personalized experience or some kind of customized experience. And that ability to single somebody out and treat them differently will often lead to a conclusion that that data is considered personal data. And then there's sort of this sort of guilt by association concept. If you have data that's identified or identifiable, and then you've got some other data that on its own might not be, if you connect those two data sets, then, you know, by association, that second data set becomes part of the personal data as well. It may be relative and contextual in some ways. So personal data in my, or a data set in my hands that has a unique identifier as part of it, and I have the ability to identify that person because I own or possess some other data that I can connect with that. So, you know, a classic example is these debates about whether or not an IP address should be personal information. A website that's logging an IP address with maybe, you know, some standard web log information about a person's visit, they might claim, and have claimed in many cases, this isn't personal information because I don't know who this person is. I don't, you know, this doesn't mean anything to me. But to the ISP that issued that IP address, that data clearly would be personal data because they have an association with a billing account or some other personal information with that IP address. Again, particularly if you look in Europe, but even the FTC has started to adopt this kind of concept. If those two parties, you know, get together and collude, they could identify that person based on the IP address, and that's led to the conclusion that in most cases, you know, you should treat an IP address as personal data. You've got specific versus general definitions. This is where we were cut off. So some laws talk about de-identification, or I'm sorry, the concept of personal data in very specific terms. It will be like almost a laundry list, like, you know, name, address, phone number, credit card number, and kind of a laundry list of data types that talk about personal information. Others have more general definitions, like information that allows you to identify an individual or something like that. So again, talking about trends, the trend is towards the more general definitions that sort of make more sense. The laundry list sort of inevitably leave something out. Sometimes they've got a catch-all at the end, like, and any other information that allows you to connect or identify somebody. But the more general definitions are sort of the way things are trending. Certain data types, I think, are almost inherently identifiable, and it's just good to keep this in mind. And the obvious ones is that first bullet, the names, email address, etc. Biometrics, anything that is unique to your body, genetic information, you know, unique iris scans, fingerprints, even voice prints could be considered personal information. Content, if you're collecting the contents of communications, contents of any user-generated content, where you don't have control over that content, there might be something in that content that identifies somebody. So if you're collecting, you know, voice snippets to be able to create a voice recognition algorithm, for example, in a research contest, you know, some voice may be very innocuous. You wouldn't be able to tell who that is without, you know, doing some kind of sophisticated analysis on it. But if the voice snippet that you collect says, "Hey, this is Mike. Here's my phone number," obviously that content makes it identifiable, and that's kind of a hard thing to manage. But if you are managing content, it's something to keep in mind, that it's very hard to anonymize that kind of content, or that kind of data. Precise location information. You know, there's more and more location-based services out there where different entities are collecting location information. And if you collect enough location information over time, it becomes very unique to a person. Now, there's only one person on the planet who, every day, Monday through Friday, travels from my home to my workplace. So you are able to sort of single out somebody at least and potentially identify them based on the collection of location information. And then there's this concept called the tapestry effect, where if you just get enough information, any one piece of which would not be identifiable to a human, that collection over time becomes quite unique. And it's possible to single out somebody. When AOL, when we spoke about failures of anonymization, AOL famously years ago publicly released a lot of search data that search terms that people had been entering into their search engine, so that researchers could do interesting work with it. And they replaced unique account IDs and IP addresses with a randomly generated unique ID for each account. But the search queries, if there were enough of them connected over time, it might be able to narrow it down into somebody's, where they live, because you're doing a lot of local searches. You might be searching on people's names, so people that are associated with you in some way. If there's enough, it's possible to narrow it down, and in some cases, at least, identify somebody. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And then finally, data about others that you might think is personal data about that person might actually reveal data about you. So, data about your social network, data about your household, data about your relatives. You might share genetic information. You might share, contact information. There's actually some really interesting research in the social networking context that talks about how information about your social network can reveal information about you. So there was this interesting experiment that was called Gaydar, that if a certain number of people in your social network happen to be, openly gay, it's quite easy to predict whether or not you are. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I know we're running short on time, so I'm gonna just run through this really quickly. The FTC, in talking about how they're thinking about concepts of de-identification and personal data, set out a framework for what data can be reasonably linked to a specific consumer, computer, or device. And this first one is kind of a punt because it doesn't really define what reasonable measures are. But if the entity takes reasonable measures to ensure that the data is de-identified, but then does two other things in addition to that: publicly commits to not try to re-identify the data, and contractually prohibits downstream recipients from trying to re-identify the data. These are interesting ideas of additional things you can do in addition to de-identification to try to provide additional protections against the risk of re-identification. I'm going to just skip through this. This slide is simply to show that the FTC's concept and the way they've defined personal data has evolved over time. From 2002 to 2012, you can see that they broadened the concept significantly. They dropped even using the term individually identifiable information to just simply call it covered information, because they wanted to get away from that concept of people thinking about those terms in very narrow ways. They added things like IP addresses and photos and videos and physical location, all those things that are kind of have become thought of as identifiable in different ways. The Hipaa rule is interesting. This relates to healthcare information and the like. And I won't go into the definition, but importantly, under the Hipaa privacy rule, there are two alternative approved methods for de-identification. One's called the safe harbor method, and the safe harbor method is sort of the analogous to that laundry list approach to defining personal data that I talked about before, where if you remove certain defined data types from a data set, that would be considered de-identified under the Hipaa rule. But they also have a second one that's called the expert determination method, where basically it is what it sounds like. You bring in an expert and they look at your de-identification method And if they can, attest that it is a valid de-identification, that also could satisfy the privacy rules. Other U.S. sectoral approaches that might be relevant here, the Kids Privacy Protection Rule, much like the FTC did between 2002 and 2012 in their consent orders that I showed on that previous screen, they also expanded the definition of personal information under the COPPA rule in 2013. Again, to add IP addresses, to add cookie IDs, to add processor or device serial numbers or other unique identifiers, photographs, video, audio files that contain a child's voice or image, and geolocation. Again, sort of mirroring those same kinds of conceptual expansions of the concept of personal data over time. And then state breach notification laws, I think, are quite interesting because they define personal data very narrowly. These are the laws that cause entities to send out notifications to consumers. You've probably all received one or more of these over the last few years about a data breach. But only certain types of personal information will trigger those, and they're fairly narrowly scoped to financial information, social security numbers, government-issued IDs, financial account numbers, and the like. Over time, some of them have been expanded, particularly the state laws, to include other types of information, insurance information, health or medical data, but they're still quite narrowly focused. I'm not going to go too far into the EU stuff, just suffice it to say it is quite broad. This definition shows the new definition under the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that'll come into effect of May next year. The red shows where it's changed, again, expanded from the previous definition under the 1995 Data Protection Directive. I've got sort of a shortcut here that it's sort of a decision tree to decide whether something's personal data under European law. So if you have some data, you ask the question if it's personal data, the answer is yes. It's almost always yes. So I'll just wrap up with some key takeaways. Again, as I said before, de-identification should be thought of as an important risk mitigation strategy, key part of legal compliance. And it's always that balance. Adopt the strongest method of de-identification that you can that's consistent with your data needs. You shouldn't have to destroy the value of your data, but you should do what you can to reduce the risk of that data. And then also one final point, just document it, document what you're doing. That's particularly important under some emerging legal standards. The FTC likes to see documentation. Under the EU laws, it's required. And it's just a good idea so you can demonstrate and show what you've done to manage the risk of the data. So with that, I will now turn it over to Daniel. Let me see if I can figure out how to do this. I think I need to make you host, Dan. Okay, I think you are host now, Dan, and now you should be able to share your screen. Hey, Dan, if you can hear me, I think your audio is muted. Can you unmute your audio? It doesn't look like I'm able to do it from here.
Sorry, I didn't realize that I was in control of the muting. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, very good. Okay, let's go back to my, and can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Okay, great. Sorry about the technical issues. And let's dive right in. I'll start by saying that I work in the Hipaa de-identification arena and work on issues related to Hipaa expert determination. So this talk will have that, excuse me, kind of general context behind it, but I think a lot of these things translate well into the FERPA context, and I'll try and make those translations for you in these slides. There are two, I think, main concerns with regard to interpretation of Hipaa de-identified data. In the Hipaa context, we have a pretty strong standard. It requires the removal of a long list, 18 different types of identifiers that include things like dates more specific than a year or any geography more specific than a 3-digit zip code. That's a fairly broad list. And the other alternative, the expert determination method, requires that an expert analyze the data and determine that there's a very small risk of re-identification. And so one of the misconceptions is the idea that it just totally doesn't work and has no efficacy. And Paul Ohm kind of led this debate with his statements and his broken promises of privacy paper, indicating that it was easy, cheap, and powerful. And I think that was an accurate statement pre-Hipaa. Just your 5-digit zip code, your full birth date, and your gender. Probably everybody has heard kind of the urban myth of that re-identifies 87% of the US population. In fact, this has been studied repeatedly, and over the last 3 decades of US Census data, the number, if you were able to pull off a entirely accurate census, is probably about 63%. But more importantly, when re-identification using these 3 data elements, zip, 5-digit zip, birth date, and gender, was attempted in 2013 by the same person who had originally cited the 87% re-identification, only 28% of the individuals were able to be re-identified. 28% is not an acceptable risk. It's not a very small risk. But post-Hipaa implementation, the estimate from that same expert is that roughly about 4 people in 10,000 could be re-identified under safe harbor. So in reality, under Hipaa's de-identification requirements, re-identification turns out to be quite expensive, time-consuming. It requires some substantive computer and mathematical skills. Excuse me, it's rarely successful. And the person who attempts the re-identification is usually uncertain as to whether they've actually succeeded. It's equally mythical and a misconception to purport that Hipaa de-identification works perfectly or permanently. Perfect de-identification is impossible. It's not able to free data from all subsequent privacy concerns, and it's never permanently de-identified. There's no 100% guarantee that the data de-identified would remain de-identified regardless of what you do with it after that de-identification process. So that leads us to an inconvenient truth. Unfortunately, de-identification leads to information loss, which may limit the usefulness of the resulting health information. And so we are not in a situation due to mathematical constraints where we can have our cake and eat it too. We can't have both perfect information and perfect protection. However, in this trade-off, note that this is on a log scale, we can receive very good increases in disclosure protection for relatively small losses of information most of the time. So we could move from having a very poor privacy protection up to where that green dot is, and we want to try and optimize that trade-off between information quality and privacy protection, and preferably optimize it in a direction that we don't lose too much information, but we've created very small risks of re-identification. So this is oriented more towards health data, but I think it's equally as true in the education and ed tech space that we realize that de-identified data is an invaluable public good. It really provides an essential tool for society in supporting scientific innovation within education and improvement in our education system improvement and efficiency. And it can serve as an engine driving very important education system improvements. Yeah, I'm going to go over a few essential re-identification concepts. The first is record linkage, the use of linkage keys or quasi-identifiers. They may not individually identify someone, but in combination, they can re-identify somebody. The distinction between being unique in the sample data, which is the data you hold, and unique in the larger population of individuals. And then straightforward methods for trying to reduce these re-identification risks. And that includes reducing the resolution of the keys that are present and increasing the population reporting sizes. So quasi-identifiers are things that don't individually identify a person. Things like gender, their age, their ethnic group, their marital status, their geography. And this may be linked in other sources to direct identifiers like their name or their, excuse me, address. And so if we increase our key resolution, for example, we have full date of birth being present here, or if we had a geography that was at the level of a 5-digit zip code, this would be a very full key because there are 365 days in a year. People can live 100 years. Their geography, there are 43,000 zip codes. So if we reduced that key resolution and took instead age and year of birth, or maybe a 3-digit zip code, we could get quite a dramatic change in the ability to uniquely link people from, for example, a voter registration list to a sample data file that might have diagnosis of procedure codes and a health information, but educational information in an education context. We need to recognize that when only one person shares a particular set of characteristics in your sample, we need to have a name to describe those individuals. We call them sample unique. And when only one person with a particular set of characteristics exists in the entire population, we'd call them population unique. The reason why it's useful to differentiate between these is that obviously all of our data in our sample data, whether it's healthcare or education data, is not necessarily unique, but those that are unique are at potential risk of re-identification by linking it up against people who are unique in the larger population. And so if the records are not unique in the sample, of course, they can't be unique in the population, so they aren't at a definitive risk of being re-identified. If the records are not in the sample at all, of course, that's not part of what you're required to pay attention to because you are the person releasing the data and need to attend only to the risks for the data that you are releasing or producing. Records that are unique in the sample but would link to multiple individuals in a larger population, while they have some probability of being re-identified, can't be re-identified with certainty. And so we have to attend to the idea of what is that probability of re-identification for those. And then, of course, only records that are unique in the sample and the population are at risk of being re-identified with exact record linkage. We can quite easily determine the proportion of sample uniques by analyzing our own data and doing cross-classification of all the characteristics. And for many characteristics, the likelihood of being unique in the larger population can be estimated from statistical models often accomplished with US Census data. Most of the methods that involve distorting the data, like adding random noise, are non-trivial to implement. They're expensive and complicated to put into place. But the two simplest methods are the most practical when we're protecting data that's coming in a continuous data stream. The most basic of these methods involve reducing the key resolution or increasing the reporting unit populations. Reducing the key resolution reduces both the proportion of sample uniques in the data and the probability that the individual is unique in the larger population. And we can do this either by reducing the number of quasi-identifiers, completely eliminating them, or reducing the number of categories or values in a quasi-identifier. We can also increase the population sizes of the geographic reporting units, and this is a pretty easily implemented solution for reducing disclosure risks, particularly if we use requirements for minimum population sizes for geographic reporting units. And that's what Hipaa Safe Harbor did. It implemented, you could only report 3-digit zip codes that contained populations with more than 20,000 individuals. However, it also requires, if you're trying this very small risk approach under the expert determination, that you conduct statistical analyses to determine what these risks are for the particular set of keys that are present in your data. Using larger population sizes for geographic reporting areas is an important method for controlling disclosure risks because increasing the population size decreases the population of the individual, or the probability that the individual will be unique within the reporting area. And ideally, we want to choose a method that allows reporting on all or most of the population, but the geographic resolution would be scaled to the underlying population density. This slide is pretty busy, but it's worth a few moments of study. It shows on a log scale, and so each time you go down one of these lines, the first is 1 out of 10, the next is 1 out of 100, 1 out of 1,000, how many individuals are unique in the US Census. And I've taken combinations of date of birth and ranged that all the way to their year of birth, and from zip 5s to zip 3s. And then I've also thrown in race. So you can see that in the census data, almost 2/3 of the individuals in that very top blue line are unique. And that gets, as the size of the reporting units, this is done by state, California being the largest, DC being towards the small end with about 600,000 individuals, the risk goes up, and you see that same kind of trend with the state population size across these. What you'll note is that if you use the Hipaa Safe Harbor method, this is all the way down well below 1 in a million. As a matter of fact, the only reason why you can see it on this graph is I inserted a half individual as being identifiable just so this would show up on the graph, because of course you can't divide by 0, and so there's no risk that's definable in the census data for those individuals. So the thing to note is Safe Harbor, of course, extremely small risk that's present there, but if we just add in race, see that dotted blue line, all of a sudden this jumps up by a full couple orders of magnitude, so 100 times larger than it was before, just adding race, and you'll also see that that changes quite a bit from state to state, depending on the heterogeneity in the racial population. Unfortunately, we need to balance our disclosure risks with statistical accuracy. And some popular de-identification methods can degrade the accuracy of de-identified data for multivariate statistical analyses or data mining methods. And this is well understood by statisticians, but it's not as well recognized and integrated into public policy. And poorly conducted de-identification can unfortunately lead us into bad science and bad decisions about whatever policy or action we're considering taking based on that data. Here's a scatter plot. You've all seen things like this before, and there's a straight line that I've fitted through it. The question is, what's the true signal here? Would this curved line be a slightly better fit? And you can see if I use a more sophisticated statistical method, such as kernel density estimation, then indeed there is a curvature to this data that's the same data that you're seeing here. However, if we try and make all the values have an equivalent value, and so we start to change these values slightly so that they all land in the same spot with sharing at least one other individual with them. Just do that again quickly. You can see that I've changed the shape of that data. And the other problem is, let's say that I don't have enough racial diversity to allow reporting of people in minority racial groups. And so I decide I'm going to lump those all together and just report white and other. A statistical test on the difference here, of course, is based on the variances. And now I've made the variance of the other group huge by combining these different groups that are quite different from each other. And so my statistical test would entirely fail to even recognize that there's a difference present here. Here are just two quick examples from the medical environments. We're doing different types of regression models, and we're doing it for a colon cancer data set and a lung cancer data set. And the thing to look at here is how high these numbers are on the scale, some as high as 60, some going up as high as almost 90%. Any place where you can see this bar is too large. Everything here is unacceptable. The commercial data set, of course, has the largest, or the commercial de-identification method had the largest distortion that was introduced into the data. But this is the percent of regression coefficients that went from not being statistically significant to being significant, or vice versa. And these are clear errors in our science that could cause great harm if acted on. This is the same thing where the statistical coefficients change direction. So they went from saying this factor causes lung cancer or colon cancer to it protects against colon cancer or lung cancer. And these are grave distortions. If this is what we're going to do to our ability to conduct accurate research, then we should probably just all give up and go home. And I think you probably see the importance of the same thing. Although it's very important in medical data, it's also important in education policy. If we're going to make incorrect decisions on a regular basis because of de-identification, I would suggest that perhaps that's the greater harm, even above and beyond the privacy harms, because now we're harming everybody with our incorrect knowledge of the world. So fortunately, this does not need to be the case. Re-identification risks can be controlled usually without losing much of the statistical accuracy of the data, but this requires a firm grounding in an extensive body of statistical disclosure control and limitation literature. Successful solutions, of course, are going to protect the privacy of the individuals while at the same time preserving the utility and the accuracy of the statistical data. The Hipaa expert determination method allows us to substitute a very small risk instead of eliminating all of the required identifiers. And so this is the list of the identifiers. I won't read the whole laundry list to you, but you will see that it's pretty extensive. And that, unfortunately, the safe harbor approach eliminates full dates for detailed geography that are often quite important for our analyses. It's also challenging to implement in complex data sets, particularly data sets that are changing over time and where we have to preserve referential integrity. And just the process of, for example, encrypting data does not result in de-identification. Hipaa's safe harbor requires its removal. So encrypting it does not get you there. It can be used under the expert determination method. And it's really not suitable for cases where we have to produce test data or development data or demonstration data, because it requires the removal of these data elements. And software development or demonstrations of software often require realistic fake data. So the important thing to understand about the expert determination method is that the risk needs to be very small. It doesn't specify that it needs to be 0, and that there's some possibility that this data could be linked back. So the key elements of the expert determination: the risk needs to be very small, that the information could be used alone or in combination with other reasonably available information by the anticipated recipient to identify an individual. I'm going to skip that slide in the sake of time because I need to bring this to a close for questions. One of the things I want to indicate, though, is you've probably seen quite a bit in the news if you follow this area. And you may see a fair amount of Twitter buzz or headlines in the news to the effect that there's no such thing as anonymous data. This is a essentially meaningless, perhaps even misleading statement if we don't give consideration to the specific re-identification context and the data details that are present, such as the particular type of data that's present, their coding schemas, whether it's the geographic or spatial data, or whether it has network properties. And we also need to consider the de-identification methods that were applied and the experimental design for the re-identification attack demonstrations. Good public policy requires reliable scientific evidence. Paul Ohm has made this assertion that data can be re-identified with astonishing ease, but I want to very quickly point out to you that the famous re-identifications don't actually give us a very good evidence with regard to his purporting a surprising failure of anonymization. Some of the things he covered in his Broken Promises papers were the re-identification of Governor Weld, the AOL attack, which Mike referred to, and the Netflix re-identification. Unfortunately, this is largely anecdotal and fairly limited evidence, and it was targeted, the re-identifications that were done were targeted to particularly vulnerable individuals and failed to provide us with reliable evidence about real-world re-identification risks. And I think although these data sources were labeled as de-identified, it's pretty clear they weren't de-identified to any kind of rigorous standard like statistical disclosure limitation methods or the Hipaa standards. There's not at all possibly enough time for me to go through all of these, but I've provided all of the references to everything in this slide. And I go through 11 different famous re-identification attacks, many of which you've heard of in the news, and some of which you didn't hear about in the news because they didn't result in, they attempted rigorous re-identification and yet only re-identified. A good example of this is the ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator, HHS attack. They attempted a re-identification on 15,000 individuals. They were able to re-identify 2 individuals, and so that has a very small re-identification risk. And some of these other attacks, Governor Weld was in a data set with almost 100,000 individuals. He's the only one reported as re-identified. There might have been more people that could be re-identified. AOL was in a almost 657,000 individuals. Netflix had almost 500,000. They re-identified 2. So the takeaway from this is that the publicized attacks on data usually did not have any HIPAA de-identification protection. They were targeted especially to vulnerable subgroups, and they didn't use any sampling to assure that they had representative results, and that the press reporting portrays re-identification as if it's broadly achievable, but there really isn't any reliable evidence supporting this portrayal. So let's just take a look at the overview of this. For Paul Ohm's famous Broken Promises attacks, there were 4 people that were re-identified out of 125 million. For attacks against HIPAA de-identified data, we have 2 people re-identified out of 128,000 individuals. And these were both adversarial attacks in which there was a attempt using a fair amount of quasi-identifiers to re-identify the individuals. And for all of the attacks listed in my table, there were 268 people who were re-identified out of 327 million opportunities. So let's get some perspective on this. Can everybody see the black dots on that slide? There it is, in case you missed it. Obviously, this slide is black because so de-identification doesn't work. This is roughly proportional to the percentage of people that were re-identified out of the number of opportunities. De-identification will fail some of the time. It doesn't mean that it is completely useless. And I would caution you, because of the way our minds work, that when a re-identification attack has been brought to life and we read about it and we see a handful of people that are re-identified, it makes us think as if subconsciously that the re-identification risks are 100%, which is really distortive of the true risk-benefit calculus that we face here. What can we conclude from the empirical evidence provided by these 11 attacks? The proportion of demonstrated re-identifications is very small, which I don't think implies that the re-identification risks are necessarily very small, especially if the data wasn't subjected to statistical disclosure limitation attempts. I just think it's not reliable scientific evidence. We need to systematically sample and attempt re-identification on a representative sample of the data. But with only 268 re-identifications made out of 327 million opportunities, Paul Ohm's assertion that we can often re-identify with astonishing ease seems dubious. And it's also clear that re-identification science and its evidence base needs to be importantly improved. So how do we move beyond anecdotes to rigorous scientific evidence approaches for dealing with re-identification risks? Well, one of the things I think we need to do, and this was proposed by one of the future privacy principals, Jewel Polanetsky, is that we need to simultaneously require both technical de-identification methods and supplement those with legal and administrative controls. And as well, I would argue that on a societal level, we really need a multi-sectoral legislative prohibition against data re-identification. And I think it's important because there's been some arguments about such bans in other countries that we try and protect re-identification research and provide a carve-out for that in circumstances where it has human subjects approval from an IRB. And then finally, I think we need some centers for excellence for combined graduate training in statistical disclosure and privacy computer science. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And we're going to open this up for questions at this point. I'm going to, I need to, let's see, participants, sorry, we're working through this. I need to turn this over to Noelle so that she can now become the host.
Hey, Dan, this is Kelsey. Thanks for a great presentation. So I think that we're a little over time. Thank you both for sticking with us in some difficult technical circumstances and for the great presentations. I think we looked at the questions. There's a couple of notes on the Google Doc. I think most of these we will be able to resolve later on Friday, but also happy to put anybody with a specific question in touch with Dan and Mike. I want to make sure that we're respectful of folks' time and don't go too far over. So quickly, thank you very much to Dan and Mike for your really insightful presentations today. This is really helpful for everybody attending. Thank you to everybody attending for spending the hour with us, and hopefully you will join us for the second part of this webinar series on Friday. Please remember to register for that through the link in the email that you received from Kelsey or Amelia. And then if you didn't register for today's meeting, again, please remember to email either Amelia or myself, and we will send out slides and notes and a recording of the presentation afterwards. So thank you all very much, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.